Hello and welcome to our live webinar, Experts Angle. This is our risk management overview for social scale-up grants. My name is Sinclair Taylor. I'm the CEO of the Westpac Foundation, and here with me today is Luke Hannon. Luke is a risk manager in our retail credit portfolio, and he's been involved in our risk reviews for the Foundation for a little while now. What Luke is going to do today is provide us an overview of how Westpac Foundation assesses risk in its grant applications. He's also going to outline why it's important for organisations, of course, to identify risk. He'll talk about the different types of risks that exist in all businesses, and of course how we think we can manage them. And this is really about Westpac sharing its risk management approaches. Westpac is a risk manager with lots of things, but managing risk is absolutely core to our business. So hopefully we can share that today with you. And make those risks relevant regardless of your operations. So in terms of our agenda today, we are going to cover the introduction to risk, the various types of risks that exist in all businesses, and of course some ways you can think about managing those risks. So let's get underway. So Luke, let's get into introduction to risk.
Thank you, Sinclair. Hello all. So I guess I'll start with the question of what is risk and why is it important? And we might begin with the mindset of a risk manager and how we think as members of the risk community. And realistically speaking, it's not too dissimilar from most other positions within a business that you might be trying to outline. We consider the purpose of the business, the mission and the vision, and what are some of the measurable outcomes for that business. And the risk mindset relates to looking at these and really trying to ascertain what could potentially go wrong or what might stand in the way of our business achieving its objectives. Once we've got this documented, we then sort of take a step back and think about the manner in which we might be able to prevent some of the risks occurring. Perhaps we could reduce the likelihood of the risk eventuating or soften the impact if the risk itself is inevitable and it does actually take place. So it's really about having a clear sense of what's important and how you might navigate these tough events. Now, from an identification perspective and how you might identify risks, ironically, it's when a risk actually takes place and something goes wrong. These events in your business are really, really valuable, so do cherish those. They're real-life examples of things that can go wrong and have actually gone wrong, and so it's always good to have a relatively robust documentation process, which we'll cover later on, but to keep in mind that if something goes wrong, you don't lose track of it, and that's noted down. Once you've sort of worked out what the scope of risk is, you can then sit down with some of your subject matter experts and discuss which one of these can really derail your organisation. And an example might be key person risk, and we'll cover this, but you could have someone that's really, really important to your organisation, and what would happen if they leave? Or a key business partner, a supplier, which could be a more concentration style risk. If that supplier goes out of business or changes their contract with you, that could have a substantial impact to the health of your organisation. And these are the sort of things that represent unique problems. Being aware of them is definitely the first step, and then taking steps to mitigate them or help to manage them is really the risk management part. Different risks and barriers can affect your enterprise in different ways. Risks are threats or likely events that could have a negative impact on your commercial or social impact of what you do. They can cost you money, they can cause your business to fail, or importantly, damage your reputation, and we will touch on that because reputation is extremely important, not only for a bank, but for your organisations as well. And so having a diligent approach to identifying risks that are appropriate to your industry type and operating environment really does reduce the likelihood of a really severe or catastrophic outcome for your business. And it improves the resilience of your organisation to withstand these, and by doing that enhances the long-term sustainability of what your business represents. What we're looking for as risk reviewers at a high level is evidence that the most appropriate risks that are relevant to your organisation have been identified, and that some sort of plan exists to not only manage these, but keep an eye on them and see what happens if they do actually unfold. And I guess we'd rather you were open and realistic about risk, because all organisations, including Westpac, take a lot of risk. But being open and realistic gives us the confidence that you're better placed to respond to them if they actually eventuate.
Okay, look, let's now have a look at the various types of risk, and we've really broken this down into four categories, which we will roll through in some detail. And we'll kick off firstly with people risk.
Yeah, certainly. What I might do is just take a quick look at banking first, and me as a Westpac risk manager, what are some of the risks that Westpac faces? First and foremost, in any bank, the most prevalent risk is credit risk, and this is essentially the risk that people will actually pay you back when you give them money. Now, that's probably not too relevant to a lot of your organisations, but it's certainly a pertinent risk for Westpac. One of the more common risks that Westpac and your organisations will share would be liquidity risk, which at a high level is essentially, have you got enough cash to meet commitments as they come in? Your commitments could be payroll, accounts payable, or any cash expense. And why this is such an issue is often there's a gap in the manner in which your suppliers need to be paid and your customers pay you. So you might have a wonderful contract with a rather large organisation, but their payment terms are 90 or 120 days. And so you do a job for them, they pay you in 4 months' time, but you need to pay your employees weekly. Superannuation payments need to be made. You might have insurance payments. And so it's managing that cash flow and ensuring that you've got enough cash in the bank to meet your commitments as they come due. Operational risk is the next category of risk, and it tends to be a bit of a catch-all in the sense that if it doesn't meet anything else, it tends to fall into operational risk. But it really deals with risks that arise in operations. Things like technology, for example. So your organisation might be very reliant on your phone systems. If the phone system goes down, how might your company recover, or is there a backup plan? Compliance risk is particularly pertinent in banking, and a good example of this for a not-for-profit might be your failure to meet your obligations under some grant conditions that you received, or perhaps you've got ISO requirements for a certification that you have and the level of quality that you output falls below that. So it's really important to make sure you have a compliance framework that outlines what your obligations are based on agreements that you have and that you're actually meeting those. And the final type of risk I'll have a quick talk about, there's two more. The first one is reputational risk, and this is really important, especially for a social enterprise, in that quite often your reputation is everything. There's really nothing worse than a bad news article or customers who've heard something really, really bad about you because something went wrong. Sometimes these things are out of your control, but there are steps that you can take to ensure that your reputation isn't damaged. And as silly as it sounds, often your response to something going wrong has a real impact on how people perceive you, because things do tend to go wrong, but it's the way in which you tackle this which really counts. And last is concentration risk. Now, for a bank, the best example I can give you of that is, from a lending perspective, do we really want to have mortgages on all the houses in one particular suburb? That's probably not the best idea. We like to spread and diversify, and that can relate to industries as well. We might not want to have too much exposure in the tennis ball making industry, for example, because if the government bans tennis, then we're going to be in a bit of strife. All our companies will be out of business. So moving on to people risk now. This really relates to, have we got the right people working for us relative to the stage or the life cycle that our business is in? Do they have the right experience, and are we giving them the right support? And does your business have a process to really look at the people that you employ and highlight those individuals that are really important to the viability of your business? And once you identify that, it's really a case of, are you taking the right steps to then ensure that their knowledge or skill set is shared? And an example might be, if you're a baker and you run a bakery and you've hired a head baker and he's got a really unique skill set to ensure that you've got a top quality product, if that head baker leaves and always unable to work, how would your business continue to produce the quality of goods that your customers are used to expecting? And so some mitigation strategies might be to properly document the manner in which he bakes bread, or have job shares so that other people can learn from him and share his skills. So you've got a sort of succession plan in place so that if these key people, whether it's your baker or a particular SME, if and when they leave, the business can continue because someone else can pick up the reins. Another key element of people, and it's often overlooked, is when your business really starts to fire on all cylinders, you know, the orders are coming in, the customers are lining up out the door, do you actually have the capacity to ramp up your business and so you can ensure you meet the actual increased demand for that? It's often not considered until it is an issue, but as you would know, sometimes your organisations have a propensity to grow quite quickly, and it's really a case of, do I have the capacity to absorb that growth? Can I leverage other strategic partners to help me out, or do I need to hire people? It's really having a plan in place to say, if this happens, what would I do? I think the second point there is, how do we retain people? And this is really what are you doing to make sure that you treat your staff in a manner that's befitting of the work that they do for you, but that keeps them happy? Have you got the right recognition and reward? And people aren't always after money, so it could really be a case of someone wants to spend more time at home. Can we allow them to work from home? Is the job suitable for that? And as we're dealing with people, right, they're human beings, what's in it for them? What's next? Some people are very, very motivated and want to take the right steps and get exposed to new things. Personally, I move jobs every few years, so it's always looking over the horizon to see what is it that I can do next. So for Westpac to make sure that they keep me, and Westpac has 40-odd thousand employees, so there's certainly no key person risk with me, but if there was, they'd be looking to say, how can we keep Luke happy? What are we going to do to ensure that he can take the next step within Westpac to ensure that we continue to benefit from his skills and keep him on board? And of course, when all that fails, you need succession planning, which we've sort of touched on. If one of your key people is going to go, what are you going to do to ensure that the gap that they leave is easily fillable and it doesn't have a detriment to your business?
That's right. So people are really important. Let's now have a look at industry risks.
So when we talk industry risk, we're touching again on approvals, and there was a good example a few years ago in the Westpac Foundation where a company came through and it looked really, really good, but there were some issues in the past where they hadn't met their obligations around food safety, and this company was really reliant on food. I mean, that was their core business, and if they can't get that right and they're having issues, then their core business is under threat. So it's really important that you make sure that any industry regulations that are upon you, you're very well aware of those. You've got a governance framework in place to ensure that if there's annual reviews or semi-annual reviews or monthly reviews that need to happen, that this takes place. Because without these certifications, in the case of a food business, you are really struggling. And Westpac has exactly the same set of ramifications in relation to APRA requirements that are on us. We attest on an annual basis that the requirements set out in certain standards by APRA are being met. And this is really important. Not only that we attest, but that we're sure that that attestation is accurate, because if APRA comes in and says, you know, this particular prudential standard says you need to do this, and we've attested to it, but we're not doing it, the worst thing that could happen to Westpac is they could essentially take our banking license away, which means we're out of business, and that's the kind of risks that we're trying to mitigate. Some big risks for you related to this would be occupational health and safety obligations, council approvals relating to the manner in which you operate your property, and also credit rating if that's important, if you're going to need funding. And I guess this is where writing down what your obligations are and having a plan, taking it to your board or to the regular governance committees that you've got, and ensuring the relevant approvals in place, that's what's really important here. It's knowing about it, having it documented, and having a framework in place so that there's never any surprises. It's also really important that the outputs, the way you document it, and we've got some examples we'll cover later on, is relatively easy to use. You might have 50 or 60 different approvals, but if you don't put them in an easy to use format, are you really going to search through 50 or 60 different folders to find out which ones are due, which ones are overdue, which ones are due in the next 3 months? Whereas if you had them, for example, in an Excel spreadsheet, you could sort by date due, and then you could really use your time wisely and forecast and say, in the next 3 months, I've got these 16 obligations coming due, therefore I need to resource adequately, or I need to devote some of my time because this is crucial. So it's really important that they're structured in a way that's easy to review and you can ensure that you're on track.
Rightio, let's now look at governance of the organisation and the risks that governance brings.
I guess governance, what are we talking about there? The word's thrown around and there's a number of different definitions. I guess we're essentially referring to the overarching management methodology that allows you, the managers, to direct control of the enterprise by using information and hierarchical management structures. I guess in terms of risk, it's how do the risks that affect your organisation, how are they identified, logged, controlled and monitored, and importantly, are the people making the key decisions actually the ones making these decisions? Do they know they're being executed, and have they got the right suite of information to make these decisions? Now these forums might be such as a regular board level meeting. Are there regular meetings, and do these meetings cover the risks, and is the information they're getting accurate? And the accuracy is a really important point that I'll stop on for a moment, because if, for example, the accuracy of your financials is called into question, it takes so much of your effort to make sure that those numbers are correct. What that does, it takes away your ability to look into the future and manage the actual business, because your focus is on making sure the numbers are right. So having accurate information that is trustworthy and from a reliable source that you can make good decisions on is super important. I guess an example would be, are you aware of any external risks? And you might be relying on government funding, and this might be changing. So, for example, if I pull one from the air, you might be getting funding from the NDIS, for example, and that's going through a raft of changes at the moment. So, is your organisation sitting down and tackling that, or aware of what these changes are, how they look like, and most importantly, how these changes have the propensity to affect your business? Because it could be a key source of revenue or source of funding, and you really need to be on the front foot and having regular meetings just to make sure that you're aware of these changes and how they're going to impact your business. The last point there is probably on timeliness of reporting. It's all good and well to have a wonderful risk framework, but if it takes 3 or 4 months for a risk and a very pertinent risk to make it all the way to your board level or your governance committee, that might be too long. So what are the channels that the people at the coalface have to ensure that these are reported and proceed up the line to get to the decision makers in time?
Okay, let's now look at competition and the risks that competition brings.
There's a number of different models out there when we talk about competition, and you may have heard of Porter's 5 forces, which I'll spend a bit of time on because it quite eloquently outlines how you can look at this and the risks that competition represents to your business. Porter's 5 forces, named after a chap called Porter, essentially looks at 5 things, because it's 5 forces. One, it looks at the competition in the industry. The second thing it looks at is the potential of new entrants into the industry. The third is the power of your suppliers. The fourth is the power of your customers. And the fifth is the threat of substitutes. Now, I'll talk about those in a bit more detail. Competition in the industry, and I guess the importance of this is the number of competitors and their ability to threaten a company. So, for example, if you open a cafe, and when you look at a cafe in Porter's 5 forces, it's crazy that you would start it, but people do, and they're very successful. But using the cafe example, there's a lot of cafes, and there's a ton of competition. And so the competition relates to the number of competitors and their ability to threaten you. If you're the only person doing something and there's a demand for that, then the question is, why isn't everyone else doing it? How long is it until more competitors arrive? But competition is important to rate. The next is the potential of new entrants into an industry. And this talks about barriers to entry. And again, if I use the cafe example, it probably costs 20 grand to set up a cafe. And so if you're the only cafe in town and someone notices that every Saturday morning your store is packed and you're making a heap of money, it's not going to be too hard for someone to rent a place opposite you and start a cafe. So there's very low barriers to entry in that. High barriers to entry could arguably be starting an airline, for example. You need a ton of capital, you need to get a lot of approvals, and you need a lot of money to get aircraft up in the air. So there's high barriers to entry. It still doesn't certainly stop people, Virgin for example, from entering, but it's not as easy as starting a cafe. The power of suppliers, this force looks at how easy suppliers can drive up the price for goods or services. Now, the cafe industry is another good one in the sense that there are so many people selling coffee that if your particular supplier of coffee, whether it's Merlot coffee or whoever it may be, they might choose to double the price of their coffee. It would be relatively easy for you to source another good quality coffee bean supplier without too much difficulty. On the other hand, if the key thing for your business is dental implants and there's only one manufacturer, if they put up the price, you really don't have much choice. You kind of need to cop that and then factor that into whether or not you think that's an acceptable risk to take. And in that example, you'd probably stop at nothing trying to work out, is there another supplier somewhere on earth that can help me out? Number one, to help me negotiate with my current supplier, but two, if they might go out of business through no fault of their own, and then you're out of business. So it's really keeping an eye on that. The power of customers is the next one, and that talks to what sort of options customers have to drive prices down. How many buyers are in the market? What is it that you do? And can customers really choose an alternative option? How much would it cost them to switch from one company to another? The cafe example again, I mean, on my way to work from Wynyard train station to 275 Kent Street, I think I passed 7 cafes in the space of about 400 metres. So if I'm not happy with one, I can walk another 30 metres and get a coffee from the next place. So as a customer, in the case of a cafe, I have a lot of power. And the last is the threat of substitutes. And this one's interesting, but again, I love the cafe example, and we studied it in detail at uni. It's really about, if I don't want to have a coffee one morning, I might choose to have a banana or a Coke or a Red Bull. And so what other products can your customer choose that might serve their need as a consumer, but come from either a different industry or a different competitor? And so I guess when we think about competition, it's really a good idea to take a look at all facets of what threat or what risks other competitors, suppliers, customers, new entrants, what they represent to you, document those down, and then have a strategy to tackle those risks if they eventuate.
Well done. Well, we don't recommend Red Bull for breakfast. But now that that is a risk. Now that we have an understanding of risk and the different types of risks that exist in all businesses, let's now have a chat about risk management and some of those approaches to risk management.
Yeah, what you can see on screen is kind of I won't call it worldwide, but it's a relatively accepted risk matrix, and it's got 2 key dimensions. On the left-hand side, going up and down, is the likelihood of a risk taking place, and across the top is the consequence. And the reason we use this, or like to use this in risk management, is that after a while you've been operating, things have gone wrong, you've spoke to your people at the coalface, you've documented a list, you've got 25 or 30 real pertinent risks that you're all worried about, but which ones are really important? Which ones can end you in a heartbeat? Which ones are sort of important, and then which risks are always going to be there that you can manage? So by using a matrix like this, it really helps you to plot those on a like-for-like basis, because how might you compare the risk of a subject matter expert leaving against a new cafe opening up next door? You can use this in a way to do that. On the left, as I've mentioned, is the likelihood of an event, and across the top is the severity of any consequences. So obviously, if your risks are in the top right-hand corner, they're almost certain to occur, and the impact to your business is critical, or another term is catastrophic. Likewise, or on the opposite, if they're on the bottom left-hand corner where you can see the green, it's kind of unlikely these are going to happen, and if they do, it's insignificant. So things like paper cups. Paper cuts might be down on the bottom right, because if it happens, it's not likely to happen these days moving into a paperless office, but if it does, a Band-Aid's probably going to fix it, and we're probably not going to need to call an ambulance. There are some really helpful tools or consequence criteria that help us to quantify these, and I'll take you through this, and there is an example of a risk register we can send out. And I'll take you through 3 different consequences: insignificant, moderate, and critical, which is sort of left, middle, and on the right-hand side on the page you're looking at. And I'll look at a few different categories. So let's start with insignificant for financial, and you might define this as a loss of up to 1% of your annual budget or projected revenue. Insignificant health and safety could be something like first aid treatment required, or insignificant reputation could be a minor adverse local public or media attention. Now, if we look at the other end of the scale and go straight to critical, critical financial is loss, omission, or 15 or 20% or more than 15% of your revenue. So our insignificant was up to 1%. Our critical is greater than 15%, and these amounts are arbitrary. They can be set based on your board meetings and your governance committees to say, well, if this happens, what's going to break us? You know, critical's kind of worst case, insignificant, and then minor, moderate, and major sort of are in the middle. Critical for health and safety, and as dramatic as this sounds, it could be a series of fatalities or significant irreversible disabilities. So you could be working with asbestos, for example, and you haven't got the right respiratory protection. I mean, if you get that wrong, that's pretty bad, right? So that's a critical risk. A critical reputation could be serious public or media outcry. So that's front page of the national paper, 6 o'clock news, you are the first story, and it's not going to end well for your business in that case. Interestingly, some risks, and I've got an interesting example. A friend of mine runs a construction company, and a person, he was building a building site in Ryde in Western Sydney, and there was a building next to him, a high-story building, and someone died on the building next to his. And he was really worried from a risk perspective that the media footage was going to have his company's banner in the background. And he got lucky in the sense, when I say lucky, he got lucky in the sense that the day this happened was also the day that the tragedy happened at Dreamworld. So, but what he did moving forward to mitigate that risk is trained all of his staff in media relations, because as you can imagine, there'd be a swarm of media at the building site next to him. There's quite a substantial propensity that one of these reporters pops over to his construction work site and hits one of the managers up, and if they don't know how to deal with the media or seem evasive, the journalist might go for gold. So his risk management strategy there was, I'm going to get media training, that's going to kind of be my control. Moving from consequences onto likelihood, and again, these criteria are set at the board level of your organisation or within your management teams, and I'll start with rare, and I'll just go all the way to almost certain. Rare may only occur in exceptional circumstances, and if we use the paper cut example again, Westpac is almost a paperless office these days, so it's extremely unlikely someone's going to get a paper cut. On the other end is almost certainly, and this is expected to occur frequently throughout the year, and so these criteria really help you to put a lens over it of, I've got this risk, what's the likelihood, what's the consequence, then I can plot it accurately in my risk matrix, pardon me, and then that will then feed into your risk plan, and I'll give you some example of what a risk plan might contain. It's essentially a risk register. You might have a date the risk was entered, a description of the risk name, some of the causes, consequences, and then some of the controls. And I'll talk about controls for a little bit there. Controls is things you can do to prevent a risk from happening. And there's a few different types of controls. The first is preventative controls. These are things that stop the risk from occurring. So if you've got a machine that cuts metal and people have got to feed that metal in by their hands, a preventative control could be a plastic shield that goes over the blade and the machine won't cut until the plastic shield's there. To use the same example, the detective control might be counting everyone's fingers at the end of the day. Because you know if some have gone, the risk has taken place. Now obviously in this case the preventative control seems like the only feasible option, but detective control is counting the fingers. A detective control might also be, if we're looking now at that machine catching fire, the preventative control could be having the right maintenance, making sure the upkeep's in order. The equipment might need to be positioned correctly, or that cooling apparatus is installed to ensure you reduce the risk of overheating. That's preventative controls. The detective control might be the installation of fire or smoke alarms. So when the risk takes place, the detective control makes sure that you know in a timely manner that something has gone wrong. So back onto our risk register, you've got controls. Then you might have an evaluation of your control. Again, because using the example of the detective control of counting people's fingers at the end of the day, is that really a satisfactory control? It's probably not. So that's not a good control. And then we might categorize our risk, and then these risks have ratings which come from our risk matrix.
And on the risk matrix, which we will share, I think a lot of people are keen on getting one up off the ground for the first time, or reflecting on what they've currently got. The colour coding is also really important as a good visual cue for board and management to really know if it's in the red, absolutely worth focusing on a very regular basis. And of course, if it's in the green, it's not set and forget, but it's obviously not, as you say, going to end your operations if those risks occur. I might just have a look now at risk management and some of those approaches there.
Yeah, certainly. So we've taken a quick look at the risk management frameworks, and we'll send a framework out using the matrix. I'll touch on some of the risks that certain ventures or people at different organisations, rather, at different life cycles, different stages of their life cycle might encounter. I mean, a new venture might look at risks that is what you're doing really going to work. You know, a bakery might be providing jobs and pathways to non-English speaking backgrounds, so you've got some communication issues there. Some of the risk could be mitigated through workplace support. Are we giving the right literacy, language and numeracy training? And that's wrapped in sort of commercial expertise. If it's an existing venture, and I'm certain most of you fall into this category, the risks can be more orientated around growth. Can you sustain the level of growth that you might have been, or the trajectory that you've been on over the past year or two? Have you got enough cash? Liquidity is a really, really important one there. Are you working with the right people? Can you manage your people? Can you expand fast enough? And is it sustainable? Because sometimes it's hard to see when you grow really fast what the actual results are like until the dust has settled. Have you got the right financial controls in place to safeguard against fraud? And unfortunately, fraud does happen. Westpac is not alone in being an organisation that's suffered with fraud. And in fact, I've got an interesting story which I told. Westpac turned 200 on Saturday, the 8th of April, and in 1820 there was a chap called William Francis, I think, and this is 1820, mind you. Westpac had been around for 3 years, and what he did was set up fictitious accounts in 1820 in the names of his friends, so that they were able to draw against uncleared funds. And Westpac actually lost, or Bank of New South Wales as it was, we lost half of our allocated capital, which was £6,000. So fraud's not a new thing. It is ongoing, and it's really about making sure the people you've got are trustworthy and they do the right thing.
It was a penal colony, so
yeah,
it's probably not that surprising.
Yeah. And I suppose from a risk perspective, it's all about risk and reward. You don't want to take risk just for the sake of taking risk. And does the reward you're getting from taking this risk justify it? Because you can't have reward without risk, but you can have risk without reward. So it's really important to make sure that the risks your organisation are taking are actually worth it. And can steps be taken to reduce that level of risk to bring that back into balance? Or is there another option or way of your organisation doing something that's really going to be or present a more palatable risk-reward ratio? The last point there talks about what banks look for when assessing risk. I guess I've covered that earlier on around what we look at. Looking at the second point, risks to key stakeholders, this really talks about your governance framework and the manner in which they're managed. Once they're logged, you've got your matrix to quantify them. Then they're generally on a register which outlines things like I've said, the risk name, the consequences, the controls. And then it's really a case of meeting regularly. Are these still effective controls that are mitigating this risk? Is this still an extreme risk? Have we taken steps to ensure that our building won't burn down? We have. Maybe we need to go back to our risk matrix, have a look at it and say, well, this risk was in the red, it's now probably in the amber or the yellow, and then recalibrating that. But it's about being on the front foot and meeting your obligations under those risks. Okay, I've got this risk, I need to do something about it. Let's tackle it head on, or let's ask for help. On the third point, I mean, what do I look for when someone asks me for money? The banks use these things called the 5 Cs, and it's not really a Westpac thing. It's, you ask anyone in credit.
Across the sector, yeah.
It's across the sector. We look at the character of what someone's like. You know, is their employment stable? Have they got a good credit history? Have they got the capacity to pay it? Capacity is the second C. The third one is collateral. So what's our second way out in this facility? If it's a credit card, there's probably not much at all. If it's a house, the second way out could be the security that we hold, or the house or the asset. The fourth C is capital, and this looks at the percent. And last but not least is conditions, in what banks look for in the 5 Cs. And this is what covenants, what rules might we put in place to ensure that the transaction is going to be as good as possible for the bank. And I guess when looking at a social enterprise, and this is talking from my time as a risk reviewer for Westpac, for the Westpac Foundation last year, what's really important to me is that is the organisation on the front foot? It's okay to have risk, but don't sweep it under the carpet. Be open. We can help you manage or identify ways you can manage that, provide some advice on that. We're keen to see what your governance framework is, and generally what's your approach to risk management. If you're in food or widget production, for example, what's your QA framework? And how does that feed into your risk management strategy? And I guess lastly, are there relevant controls in place? Are you taking the right steps to mitigate the risks that you've identified, or taking the right steps to try and work out what they are?
And I think just to add to that, one of the key risks that exists in all businesses, of course, is financial controls. And one thing we're keen to help our grant recipients work through is the way they control the way finances move within their organisation. There is obviously a large opportunity for fraud, and certainly across the non-profit sector, fraud does occur. And then one of the common themes, and this is reflecting, I guess, on the bank's broader experience more so than the foundation, thankfully. But one thing that we do note is that when fraud occurs in the non-profit sector, there's an overwhelming desire to sweep it under the carpet, as you say, because of the reputation impact of that organisation. They will simply pretend the theft didn't occur or the like. They won't involve the police because they just don't want the story to get out. So yeah, we're keen to help organisations think through those financial risks, and that could be the simplicity of having 2 people to authorise transactions through internet banking. More and more organisations have moved away from checkbooks for lots of obvious reasons, so it's not just one person to sign a cheque anymore. It's that sort of day-to-day money management which often represents a significant operational risk within organisations that we fund. But before you get to, I guess, those external risks of competitors and how we're well placed against other people doing the same thing as us, and licensing and the many risks that we have, I guess, touched on today.
Yeah. I think we've got a question.
Yeah, so time now for some questions. I'm just going to have a quick read. It's in the fine print here. So a question just about what are the most common risks that social enterprises are exposed to?
That's an interesting question, in that the 2 social enterprises I reviewed last year were vastly different. So one of the risks one of them was facing was around government changing legislation and how that might impact some of their funding. The risks of the other organisation were more around the manner in which they secured funding was really concentrated on a single source, and also they produced widgets, this particular organisation. So the key risk I saw for them was how do they control their quality, and what steps are they taking to ensure that the quality framework is fed back to the people making the widgets in a manner that's quite quick, because the industry this particular organisation was in had very low barriers to entry, and the competition was high, so customers weren't very sticky. And the social enterprise story is good, but customers will only tend to hang on for so long if the quality or the product of the product you're producing is substandard. So the risks are quite unique to each organisation. In both cases, however, they were astutely aware of these and had documented them and had a framework in place to try and management. The QA framework needed a little bit of work on the one I mentioned, but they were aware of it, which was quite important.
And I think another way to think through that is, and you touched on this earlier, we want to see organisations acknowledging risk. And so I think the greatest risk is that people don't acknowledge risk.
Certainly.
And we say in our organisation that risk is everyone's business. The bank's Chief Risk Officer is a Director of the Westpac Foundation, so unsurprisingly we are keen on risk and understanding it. But all jokes aside, risk is a responsibility for 40,000 staff across the Westpac Group, and I think that's the sort of cultural importance that we really need to see organisations externally placing on risk in its many forms. Of course, management and board have a key responsibility, and often they are legal responsibilities in terms of managing risk well. But it needs to be everyone's business. I think that's one of the cultural messages that takes time to embed.
Certainly is, yes.
Okay, next question. We'll be able to get feedback on our risk framework from Luke's team. So this is the risk and finance team that review the applications through the process. So, Luke?
Certainly, the short answer to that question is yes. This year, I believe business mentors will be assigned to each of you, and so there'll be a very hands-on approach between your organisation. The business mentor is sort of the medium between your organisation and the risk reviewers, so there'll be a really good dialogue on not only what their opinion of the health of your risk plans are, but ways in which you could improve it. So I suspect that will be quite prevalent this year, and expect a lot of communication to really help you get to the next level if that's what's needed.
That's right, and remembering, of course, that our motivation around helping organisations with risk is to really help them improve their long-term sustainability, financially and socially, by adequately managing those various risks, so that the organisation is here in the years to come and delivering great social outcomes. So feel free to post any further questions, and we'll address them now. But just to recap on my comment at the start of the session, that all of this is recorded and will be available via the Davidson Institute website, of course including the slides. So you will get a copy of this, which you can then share with whoever you would like. So we'll just wait a little bit longer to see if there's any further questions. Otherwise, we will wrap up and give you some time back in your day. Okay, well, we might take that as no further questions. So thank you very much for joining us on the line, and thank you, of course, Luke, for sharing your risk expertise.
My pleasure.
Yeah, look forward to getting this out through the Westpac Foundation website and also the Davidson Institute website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Cheers. Thank you.